Mr. Phigg led a curious-looking band out of bed quarters and across to the door in the hillside. Arthur's white fleece was black now, after a good coating of hair dye. Johanna and Harry had black face paint smeared below their balaclavas. So did Mr. Phigg, who had also strapped his camera to his forehead. At the door, he took out his silver key, breathed on it, and then polished it on his sleeve. "I've got to get this one just right. We don't want to end up in the crack between the two sets of downs." "Ah," he said, as they stepped out into dense undergrowth, "not quite where I was expecting." He led them down a series of increasingly narrow and more winding pathways, all overgrown with ferns and creepers. They seemed to double back on themselves several times, as if they were going in circles. Johanna was just about to ask if Mr. Phigg knew where they were, when they pushed their way through some particularly thick brambly branches and popped out at the bottom of a tall hedge. At the other end of the field was the grey fence of the Windmill Farm site. The gate was about 200 yards away. "Over here!" hissed a voice, and they turned to see Lawrence with the Metawetter behind a large oak tree. Lawrence had swapped his lab coat for a set of dark overalls. "Where on earth have you been?" "And where's Bartram?" asked Hoxton, who was standing on Lawrence's shoulder. "Though it's always a pleasure to see you, Arthur, of course." Mr. Phigg quickly explained what had happened, then called the children to him. He pulled the shower curtain to one side and got into the Metawetter. "Now, this is going to be a bit cosy to start with," he said, as Johanna and Harry squeezed in next to him. "It's already set to shorter water," said Lawrence. "Just turn the tap on." Mr. Phigg did, and Johanna and Harry were astonished by what happened next. A jet of icy water poured onto them, but even before they were able to gasp in shock, they felt a strange warmth all around their bodies, deep in their bones. And although the water had hit them, they somehow weren't wet. A moment later, the walls of the Metawetter seemed to hurtle out away from them at enormous speed. But then the movement stopped, and the corner of a now gigantic shower curtain flicked open, and they realised that they had shrunk. "Well, you're still taller than me," said Hoxton, hopping into the shower to join them. "The effect's not that impressive." Mr. Phigg put an arm around the hamster's shoulders and said, "Hush, or we'll give you a spray of something too." Then the curtain was pulled fully open, and Lawrence's enormous hairy hand picked them up one at a time and placed them onto Arthur's back. "This will be the quickest way of getting you across to the gate," he said, "and we had assumed a sheep wouldn't attract much attention here on the downs. But after what happened to Bartram—" "It's still our best bet," said Johanna. "Let's go." "Hold on tight," said Arthur, and they all lay flat on his back, grabbing handfuls of his thick dark wool. He trotted purposefully across the field, and then stopped to let them off, just along the fence from the gate. "When I give the signal," said Mr. Phigg, and he, Hoxton and the children edged along the fence until they were just next to the gate, but still hidden in the shadows. Then he raised his arm. Arthur had gone a few yards further back into the field. On the signal, he unleashed a volley of the loudest baaing the children had ever heard. There was a scrambling inside the gate and a shocked "What the?" from one of the guards. Then searchlights played across the field until they fixed on Arthur, who gave one more baa for good measure before ambling away. "Wretched sheep," said the guard. "Do we need another one?" said a different voice. "Oh, no, not now. Apart from anything else, I've just made a cup of tea." The lights clicked off again. Meanwhile, the 4 small intruders had slipped through the gate unseen and were inside the farm site. They regrouped behind a builder's hut, out of sight from the gate. "Right," said Mr. Phigg, pulling his gold watch from his waistcoat. "Just another couple of minutes, and we'll be back to normal size. Then we can have a proper look around. Lawrence said it wouldn't last as long doing 3 of us at the same time." As he spoke, the children suddenly felt the strange warm feeling again, spreading out from the middle of their bones, reaching all round their bodies in a moment, and then the ground was shooting rapidly away from their startled eyes. "Whoa!" said Mr. Phigg, shaking himself. "That was bracing." Johanna, Harry, he touched the tops of the children's heads, which were now back at their normal distance from the ground. "Where's Hoxton?" "Here," squeaked a high voice from down between their feet. He scampered up Mr. Figg's leg and squeezed into a waistcoat pocket. "I know my place." They started to explore, in the faint light filtering back from the floodlights by the gate. "There's so much here already," said Johanna. "How have they built it so quickly?" "They can't have waited for the formal decision," said Mr. Phigg. "Someone at the council has bent the rules to let this happen. But anyway, what do you think they've done with young Bartram?" There were 2 long, low buildings stretching out in front of them, each about 50 yards in length. At the far end, between them, and in front of the old windmill, was a taller 3-storey block. They could see some lights on in its upstairs windows. "That's interesting," said Mr. Phigg. "Somebody's home up there. But let's have a look at these blocks first." He went up to the door of the nearest building. A sign above it read, "Turkeys." "Fancy some tasties now, Harry?" he asked, turning the handle. Harry snorted briefly in response. Once they were inside, Mr. Phigg produced a small torch from his pocket and shone a light in front of them. The building was still a shell. The walls were all in place, but the builders had only just started to install the fittings and machinery. They walked down a long central corridor. "There'll be cages all along here for the poor birds," said Mr. Phigg. Then the corridor opened out into a bigger space. "This will be the start of the processing part, and I'm afraid the processing won't start in a very pleasant way." Johanna shivered. "It's horrible," she said. "Oh, it will be," said Mr. Phigg. They carried on walking into another big room. "There'll be a conveyor belt through here, I guess, making the fascinating journey from turkey to tasty," said Mr. Phigg. "Then there'll be packaging and—" He pushed some side doors open and looked in. "Yes, this will be for freezing and storage." They carried on walking and eventually came out into a bigger space with a huge metal door across the whole of its end wall. "And here's the dispatch area. They'll back big lorries up to that door and send the stuff off all round the country." "It's huge," said Johanna, as they retraced their steps back to the front door of the building. "Huge and scary." "And there's another one like it just across next door," said Mr. Phigg. He turned off his torch and they went outside and crossed over to the second building. "It looks exactly the same from the outside." They came up to the front door and read the sign above it. "Mutton." "Ah," said Mr. Phigg quietly. "This is starting to make sense." He grimaced as he met Johanna's wide-eyed stare. "What is?" asked Harry. "Why? What's mutton?" "It's meat," his sister replied, stony-voiced. "Meat that you get from sheep." She grabbed the door handle and led the way into the building, then pulled up sharp as she saw what was inside. "Oh no," she said. "This block is finished." In the beam from Mr. Figg's torch, they saw long rows of bare metal cages lining a stark, white-tiled corridor. "Do you think Bartram—" Harry began, but his voice trailed away. "All the cages here are empty," his sister replied. The corridor opened into a wide room, and Johanna gasped, tears welling into her eyes. An array of machinery, shining steel, sharp hooks, and vicious-looking blades, conveyor belts and chains. It was obvious what would happen here, and she didn't want to think about exactly how it would happen. "It all looks finished. Do you think they've already used it?" "No," said Mr. Phigg firmly. "It's much too clean and tidy. Don't worry." He ushered the children quickly through into the next room. Belts and machinery and huge waiting rolls of card and plastic showed that this was the packaging area. Everything was pristine and unused. They looked behind and underneath the various machines and packaging. Again, no sign of life. But just as they were moving through into the dispatch area, they heard a plaintive "bah." The torchlight found a small steel cage to one side of the main doors out of the building, and in the middle of the small steel cage stood a very sad-looking sheep. "Bartram!" shouted Johanna and Harry together, and ran over to him. They reached through the bars to touch him, and he nuzzled their hands. "Thank goodness," he said. "I've been hoping so hard you'd still come this evening. I've been thinking all the time that, he swallowed hard, that something might happen." "Well, we've happened now," said Mr. Phigg, as his silver key made short work of the padlock on the cage door, and Bartram trotted out into their waiting arms. "But how did I ever get here?" he asked at length. "I was hanging out with Arthur in our field. I lost my footing somehow and slipped under the hedge. Then I just kept falling. It was such a weird feeling, falling and falling, till I rolled out underneath a tree across the field from this place." "It's all getting worse and worse," said Mr. Phigg. "The boundary between the grey world and the Slumber Downs is shifting, with new gateways opening and closing. It's a mess, and we've got to put a stop to it somehow. So, let's get out of this horrible building and find a way of doing it," said Johanna. She bent down and pulled the sliding door up far enough for Hoxton to get underneath and check that there was nobody nearby. "All clear?" he squeaked. "I didn't have much more time," said Bartram with a shudder. "When they shut me in the cage, the guards were talking about running a test tomorrow morning, and then laughing about free samples. One of them said he knew what he was going to bring in at lunchtime." "What was that?" asked Johanna. "A big jar of mint sauce."